Every morning before school, the girl crossed a quiet street with a paper bag pressed to her chest. The bag was always warm. Biscuits, eggs, sometimes a small note written in uneven pencil. She was 13, slight, black, and careful in the way children become careful when the world has already taught them to be. She stopped at the same house, the one with peeling white paint and a mailbox that leaned like it was tired. An old man waited inside. He never opened the door wide, just enough to take the food, nod once, and say her name like it mattered. On the morning it broke, a patrol car rolled past too slowly. The girl felt it before she saw it. The pause, the watching. The officer didn't stop. He circled the block instead. By afternoon, neighbors were whispering. Someone had posted a clip. Grainy phone footage of the girl on the porch. The old man's door half open. A voice off camera asking why a minor was entering a private residence every day. The caption didn't ask questions. It accused. Within hours, the comments hardened. Words like suspicious, grooming, trespassing. People who had never stood on that street decided what the scene meant. The next morning, the knock wasn't gentle. It wasn't one officer. It was four. Two in standard patrol uniforms. Two in pressed military dress. Faces unreadable, posture exact. The girl froze in the hallway, barefoot on cold tile, her school backpack still by the door. Her mother stepped forward, confused, hands already shaking. They asked for the girl by full name. They said there had been reports. They said protocols required follow-up. They said they needed to ask questions about her daily contact with a retired serviceman. The girl's throat closed. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had done the same thing she'd done for months. Walked over, delivered breakfast, checked if he was breathing. Come home. Outside. Phones appear behind curtains. Someone across the street began recording openly. The military officers didn't stop it. They welcomed witnesses. The oldest officer looked at the girl like a file he hadn't finished reading. He asked who told her to go there. He asked if she was being compensated. He asked if she understood the seriousness of unsupervised access. Her mother tried to answer. They cut her off. The paper bag from that morning still sat on the kitchen counter, unopened now. The biscuits had gone cold. The injustice wasn't loud. It didn't shout or curse. It stood calmly in the doorway, dressed in authority, and implied that a child's kindness was something dangerous. Down the street, the old man waited, breakfast late for the first time since winter. He didn't know yet that the quiet routine that kept him alive had just been turned into a case number. No one mentioned the missed medications, the failing legs, or the daughter lost of war. Only the optics, the risk, the record, and the authority of interruption without context offered. By noon, the story had moved faster than the truth ever could. A local blog reframed the video with sharper language. A radio host hinted at negligence. The phrase, ongoing investigation, began circulating before any facts had been gathered. The girl sat at the kitchen table while her mother fielded calls, each one tightening the air in the room. School administrators wanted to know why she hadn't shown up. Child services left a voicemail asking to schedule an interview. No one asked what the breakfasts were for. Across the street, the old man noticed the silence first. No knock, no soft footsteps. He waited longer than usual, staring at the door like it might apologize. When it didn't, he tried to stand. His knees failed him halfway. He lowered himself back down with controlled breath, the kind learned from decades of discipline. He reached for his phone. His hand shook too much to unlock it. By evening, a second patrol car arrived at the girl's house, this time without lights. The same officers, now joined by a woman in a county blazer, badge clipped neatly at the hip. The questions resumed, slower, colder. They asked about the old man's health, about how long she stayed inside, about whether she had keys. The girl answered carefully, eyes fixed on the table, voice small but steady. She said she rang the bell. She said she left the food on the counter. She said she stayed only long enough to make sure he took his pills. That detail landed wrong. The woman paused. Pills meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant liability. By nightfall, the girl's name was circulating online, blurred but recognizable. Commentators debated whether kindness needed regulation, whether intent mattered less than appearance. The video climbed. The clip replayed on screens where context didn't fit. No one went to the old man's house. On the second day, a formal notice arrived. Temporary restriction. No further contact pending review. The girl read it twice. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from confusion. The rule felt heavy and empty at the same time. She wasn't allowed to help. That was all it said. Her mother drove her to school anyway. Whispers followed her down the hallway. A teacher pulled her aside and spoke in careful tones about safety and boundaries. The girl nodded. She had learned that nodding made adults move on faster. That afternoon, the old man missed his medication window. By the third day, neighbors started asking questions that hadn't made the feed. Why the porch light stayed on all night. Why mail piled up. One woman walked up and knocked. No answer. She shrugged and went home. Someone else posted a photo, captioned a concern. It got fewer likes. Inside the house, the old man lay on the couch, breathing shallow, the television murmuring to no one. His military discharge plaque hung above the mantel, polished out of habit more than pride. Decades ago, he had enforced rules. Now he was being erased by them. On the fourth day, the escalation turned procedural. A formal interview was scheduled at a county office. The girl and her mother sat under fluorescent lights while a recorder blinked red. Questions were asked in sequences. Dates, times, duration. The girl corrected them when they got details wrong. The interviewer frowned slightly each time. Precision disrupted narrative flow. They asked why she volunteered. She said because he needed help. They asked why she hadn't told more adults. She said she thought helping was allowed. The interviewer wrote something down. Outside, a man with a camera waited. He asked no questions, only filmed. The girl walked past him without looking up. Her mother placed herself between them. That night, the old man didn't answer the phone when a fellow veteran called to check in. The call went to voicemail. The veteran assumed he was asleep. On the fifth day, sirens finally broke the quiet on the old man street. Too late to be dramatic, just enough to be official. Paramedics entered through the unlocked door. They moved quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. One of them noticed the untouched pill organizer. Another checked the calendar on the fridge. Breakfast deliveries marked in pencil. Every day until the square went blank. The escalation wasn't sudden. It was layered. It built through omission, through procedures applied without sight, through authority that mistook caution for care. When the girl heard the sirens from her classroom window, she didn't know why her chest tightened. She just knew something had tipped, and whatever balance she'd been holding was gone. By the time the ambulance doors closed, the story online had already shifted. Now it was about response time, about welfare checks, about who should have noticed sooner. Still, no one asked who had stopped the breakfasts. The official response arrived before the diagnosis did. Statements were drafted. Language was chosen carefully. The county cited established safeguarding protocols and emphasized that actions have been taken out in abundance of caution. The phrase repeated itself across platforms like a shield. Caution became the justification. Authority became invisible behind it. At the hospital, the old man was stabilized but unresponsive. A nurse checked his ID and paused when she saw his name. She glanced at the service record attached to his chart, the commendations. The discharge status marked honorable in clean ink. She asked if anyone had been notified. There was a blank space where an emergency contact should have been. Back at the county office, a supervisor convened a closed meeting. The footage was reviewed again. The comments were monitored. The decision was made to stay the course. No reversals. No admissions. The risk of precedent was discussed more than the risk of harm. Child services escalated their involvement. A home visit was scheduled. Clipboards, checklists, neutral expressions. They inspected the girl's room. They asked about her friends. They asked if anyone had coached her answers. The implication hovered without being spoken. Her mother answered calmly, but her voice began to thin at the edges. She had done everything right. That made the pressure worse. The girl was instructed not to speak to anyone about the case. At school, she was removed from her usual activities temporarily. A guidance counselor suggested distance would help things settle. The girl watched from a bench as her classmates lined up for dismissal. She felt like she was being erased in real time. Across town, the old man's condition worsened. Dehydration had compounded existing issues. A doctor noted the timeline: missed medications, missed meals. The absence of routine stood out sharply against his otherwise managed health history. The doctor asked who normally assisted him. A social worker flipped through a file and found only restrictions, not support. The misuse of authority didn't announce itself. It operated through silence, through forms that redirected responsibility, through decisions made in rooms where the affected were not present. Each agency pointed to another. Each citation referenced policy. No one referenced a child who had been doing the work for free. A press liaison released a short update expressing concern and reaffirming commitment to safety. The update did not mention the restriction order. It did not mention the breakfasts. It framed the incident as unfortunate but unrelated. That framing spread. Online, the tone shifted again. Some voices questioned whether the response had gone too far. Others doubled down. The original clip resurfaced with edits, zoomed in, slowed down, framed as proof of something still unnamed. The comments argued theory, while reality lay connected to monitors in a hospital room. Inside that room, a Veteran Affairs representative finally arrived. He recognized the name. He recognized the service number. He asked why he hadn't been notified sooner. The nurse didn't have an answer. She handed over the chart. The representative read the notes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. At the county office, a junior analyst flagged an inconsistency. The restriction ordered timestamp before any substantiated finding. The analyst brought it to a supervisor. The supervisor told him to focus on his assigned tasks. The file was already active. Interference was discouraged. Authority closed ranks. The girl was called in for another interview. This time, the question circled her emotional state, whether she felt pressured, whether she felt attached. The word attachment was underlined twice on the form. The girl answered honestly. She said she cared. The interviewer nodded, as if that confirmed something. Her mother asked if the restriction could be lifted now that the old man was hospitalized. The answer came quickly. No, the process had to run its course. At the hospital, the old man regained consciousness briefly. He asked for water. He asked what day it was. He asked if the girl had been by. The nurse hesitated. She said someone would explain soon. No one came that day. The misuse peaked quietly. A recommendation was drafted suggesting ongoing supervision for the girl's extracurricular activities. It cited risk assessment language and behavioral indicators that sounded clinical but meant nothing in practice. It was protection theater, designed to show action without addressing cause. A local reporter requested access to the full case file. The request was denied. Privacy was cited, the same privacy that had not protected the girl's image online. The Veteran Affairs representative made his own call. He contacted a retired colonel he trusted. He shared the timeline. He shared the restriction. He shared the hospital report. The colonel listened without interruption. Then he asked for the names of the officers who had come to the door. By the time the girl returned home that evening, a black sedan sat parked down the block. It did not display county markings. It did not display military plates. It waited with the engine off. Inside, the misuse of authority still believed it was untouchable. It had followed the rules as written. It had checked boxes. It had protected itself. It did not yet know that it had also created a record. And records, once complete, have a way of turning. The first call didn't come with warnings. It came with requests. Quiet ones. A colonel's aide reached out to the county office asking for clarification on a restriction involving a decorated retired serviceman. The tone was neutral. The timing was not. By then, the hospital had flagged the case internally. Miscare linked directly to an external directive tends to do that. The county returned the call with prepared language. Safeguarding. Precaution. Independent processes. The aide listened, thanked them, and asked for copies of the orders, timestamps included. He asked which authority had jurisdiction. He asked whether military liaison had been notified at any stage. There was a pause. By the next morning, the black sedan was joined by another. This one carried credentials that did not need to be displayed loudly. 2 officers entered the county building without ceremony. They didn't ask to see supervisors. They asked to see records. Their questions were narrow and exact. Names, dates, chains of authorization. The file was produced. It was thorough. That was a mistake. Every signature lined up. Every decision referenced policy. Every action was documented as compliant. What the file also showed, clearly and without argument, was cause and effect. A restriction imposed without substantiation. A support gap created without replacement. A harm that followed in sequence. At the hospital, the old man was awake long enough to give a statement. His voice was weak, but his memory was intact. He explained the breakfasts, the routine, the pills. He explained that the girl had been the only consistent help since his wife died. He explained that he had asked the county for assistance months earlier and been placed on a waiting list. The statement was recorded. It was witnessed. It was signed. That afternoon, the original patrol officers were pulled from duty, not suspended, reassigned pending review. The language was careful, but the message was not. Internal Affairs opened a parallel inquiry. Military oversight requested joint cooperation. The county's insistence on independence suddenly became collaboration. The power shift didn't happen in public first. It happened in conference rooms where tone changed, where questions stopped being hypothetical, where authority had to answer to another authority that spoke less and documented more. A senior county official attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. He emphasized community sensitivity. He emphasized optics. The colonel listened, then slid a copy of the hospital timeline across the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This is not optics," he said. "This is neglect caused by your directive." The restriction order was suspended within the hour. At the girl's house, the knock came again. This time it was one officer. No camera, no entourage. He handed over a written notice. The language acknowledged error without using the word. It stated that contact was permitted immediately. It stated that prior limitations were no longer in effect. Her mother read it twice. Then she sat down. Across town, a press embargo lifted. A reporter who had been denied access received a call back with an offer for comment. This time, the county spoke carefully. This time, they referenced review and cooperation. They avoided specifics. They could not avoid the question that followed. Who stopped the breakfasts? By evening, the story had flipped. The same clip circulated again, now paired with hospital records and service citations. The comments changed tone. The narrative found its spine. Authority that had assumed its version would stand was now watching it unwind frame by frame. The girl returned to the old man's house the next morning with the same paper bag. She rang the bell. It took longer this time. When the door opened, he smiled, small and tired, but unmistakably there. A nurse watched from the hallway, noting the interaction. This one went into the file, too. What had looked like a minor precaution had revealed itself as a cascade, and the people who had triggered it were now reading emails marked urgent, realizing that the rules they hid behind were about to be applied to them. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded methodically, the way accountability often does when it is finally taken seriously. The first was administrative, almost quiet. Suspension notices were issued internally, not announcements, not press releases, but formal letters delivered in sealed envelopes. 2 patrol officers were placed on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the joint inquiry. Their body camera footage was pulled in full, not just a circulated clip. The missing context was restored, frame by frame, sound included. The review board noted how quickly suspicion had hardened into action, how little verification had preceded the restriction, how the presence of military officers at a civilian door had escalated perception without legal necessity. That decision alone triggered a separate line of inquiry into protocol misuse. The county supervisor who had signed off on the restriction was called in next. He arrived confident, prepared to cite policy. He left quieter. The board asked him to walk through the timeline out loud. When he reached a moment where support should have been arranged and instead was not, he stalled. Silence filled the room. Silence, unlike policy language, does not bend. At the hospital, the old man's recovery was slow but steady. Hydration returned color to his skin. Medication stabilized his breathing. A social worker, newly assigned and visibly embarrassed by the file she inherited, arranged in-home assistance effective immediately. Meals were scheduled. A nurse visit was added. The waiting list explanation disappeared from the record. Veteran Affairs issued their own notice. They acknowledged a lapse in coordination and formally recognized the girl's role as an unpaid caregiver. The acknowledgement was not symbolic. It carried weight. It reframed the narrative from suspicion to service. That reframing rippled outward. A formal apology was drafted for the family. It took several revisions. Legal insisted on neutral phrasing. Oversight insisted on clarity. The final version named the harm without naming intent. It acknowledged that actions taken had contributed directly to medical distress. It stated that safeguards had failed. The girl read the letter quietly. She did not cry. She folded it and placed it back in the envelope. It did not erase the days she had been watched, questioned, restricted. It did not erase the way her classmates had looked at her. But it did mark a line. On one side was implication. On the other was record. The media cycle intensified as details became verifiable. Reporters obtained confirmation of the joint inquiry. Anonymized sources described pressure within the county to close ranks and how that pressure cracked. One headline asked why kindness had been treated as threat. Another asked who benefited from precaution without compassion. The officers involved were called before an internal panel. Their testimony was procedural. They described following instincts, responding to reports, erring on the side of caution. The panel listened, then asked why no welfare check had been performed on the old man once contact was restricted. There was no satisfactory answer. The military officers faced a separate review. Their involvement, though requested, had been deemed excessive. Their presence had added intimidation where none was warranted. One received a formal reprimand. Another was removed from liaison duties indefinitely. Their careers would continue, but with notation. In institutions like theirs, notation is never invisible. The county announced policy revisions. They framed them as proactive improvements. Mandatory welfare continuity plans when civilian assistance is interrupted. Clearer thresholds for restriction orders involving minors. Oversight review before enforcement. These were presented as forward-looking, but everyone understood why they were happening now. Behind closed doors, the supervisor resigned. The statement cited personal reasons. No one challenged it. At school, the girl was reinstated fully. The guidance counselor apologized awkwardly, eyes downcast. The teacher who had once pulled her aside now asked her to speak to the class about volunteering. The girl declined. She preferred not to be framed at all. The old man watched the coverage from his living room. Nurse nearby, breakfast warm on the table. When a reporter requested an interview, he said no. He had spent a life in service. He did not need a microphone to validate it. What mattered was that the doorbell rang again each morning, and this time no one questioned why. The final consequence was the one that lingered. Trust, once fractured, did not snap back cleanly. The girl remained cautious. Her mother watched every official interaction more closely. Authority, stripped of its assumption of benevolence, now had to earn its presence. The inquiry concluded with findings made public. Errors acknowledged, procedures criticized, names redacted but roles specified. It was enough. Not perfect, but complete. What had begun as a quiet act of care had exposed a system more concerned with appearances than outcomes. And in doing so, it had forced that system to look directly at the harm it could cause when it forgot the people inside the paperwork. Reform did not arrive as a ceremony, but as a series of documents that quietly changed how authority behaved afterward. County procedures were rewritten to require verified welfare continuity whenever informal care was interrupted by enforcement actions. No restriction could proceed without a documented replacement plan reviewed by an external oversight desk. Military liaison rules were narrowed, limiting presence to defined threats rather than ambiguous perception-based complaints. Training modules were updated, using anonymized case material that employees recognized immediately despite the redactions. The emphasis shifted from defensive caution to measurable outcomes, with failure points logged instead of quietly excused. Supervisors were required to certify not just compliance, but comprehension of downstream human impact. Independent audits were scheduled annually, and their findings were published in plain language accessible to the public. At the hospital, coordination protocols with Veteran Affairs were formalized to prevent isolation through bureaucratic delay. Community programs received funding earmarked specifically for transition coverage when volunteers were restricted or unavailable. Schools adopted guidance protecting students from premature stigma during investigations, with privacy enforced consistently. Press officers were instructed to avoid narrative framing until verified facts were established and disclosed together. None of these measures mentioned the girl by name, yet each line traced back to her mornings. Her routine had exposed a gap between policy intent and lived reality, and that gap was finally addressed. Officials spoke of lessons learned, but the real change appeared in what no longer happened afterward. Restrictions now triggered help, not absence, and suspicion required corroboration before consequences. The system began to measure success by continuity preserved rather than risks merely avoided. Accountability was recorded, audited, and taught, turning a failure into institutional memory. In quiet offices, checklists changed, signatures slowed, and assumptions were challenged. That was a reform, not a promise, but a pattern corrected so harm would not repeat. Community briefings explained the changes plainly, answering questions without defensiveness or selective omission. Oversight dashboards tracked timelines publicly, making delays visible and responsibility impossible to blur. For once, transparency was designed as prevention rather than damage control after outrage. The reform settled in slowly, becoming ordinary, which was exactly the point. Ordinary safeguards, quietly enforced, replaced extraordinary reactions driven by fear. That ordinariness signaled a system learning to protect people without punishing care. It was late, but it was real, and it remained because records, not excuses, now carried the weight. Moving forward, the girl still crossed the streets some mornings, but now she walked slower, not from fear, but from awareness. The world had shown her what it did to quiet kindness when it was misunderstood, and what it could do when that misunderstanding was finally corrected. She carried the paper bag the same way, pressed close, heat seeping through. The old man opened the door wider now, not because he had to prove anything, but because there was nothing left to hide. Inside his house, the routines returned. Pills taken on time, breakfast eaten warm, the television turned low. A nurse logged the visit and smiled at the girl without suspicion. Ordinary moments, protected by changes most people would never notice. At school, the whispers faded. The story moved on, as stories always do. What remained was quieter. The girl's confidence rebuilt itself in layers. She learned that dignity could bend without breaking, and that standing still while the truth caught up was sometimes the bravest choice. The old man watched her leave each morning, steady now, supported, alive. He had enforced rules once, long ago, believing they existed to serve people. For a moment, he had seen what happened when they forgot. He was still here to see them remember. This was not a story about heroes or villains. It was about accountability arriving without noise, and systems learning the cost of ignoring care. It was about what happens when records tell the truth, when authority is forced to listen, and when reform is written in response to harm rather than outrage. For those listening, the lesson was simple and uncomfortable. Pay attention to the quiet routines around you. Question authority when it disrupts care, without replacing it. Demand processes that protect people, not just institutions. Because justice does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives with a warm breakfast, delivered again uninterrupted.